Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. Summer of 1966, Batmania in full swing. How did we get here to here in 2022 with the incredible success of the current Batman film? But there'd be no way this film would be possible without what this artist did 50 years ago in 1972. In 1973, his version of the Joker is totally responsible for the success of the film Jokers of the last 30 plus years. In fact, there would be no Dark Knight at all if it wasn't for what this artist did in one issue in 1968. In fact, there'd be no Dark Knight, the graphic novel. Frank Miller was a student of this particular artist. He lived and breathed like a whole generation did on images like that. So because this artist did away with this image and chose to return Batman to his original conception as a creature of the night, we got this Batman. And tonight, folks, we're going to take a great overview of the greatest Batman artist of all time. His name was Neal Adams. He passed away a few weeks ago at the age of 80. And my name is Arlen Schumer. I worked with Neal at his Continuity Associates back in the 80s, and I was of a generation that came of age with Neal's Batman and think of him as the greatest Batman artist of all time. So how did we get from there to here or here to there? Well, after the Batmania buzz wore off, by 1967, DC Comics needed something else as Batmania waned. They were losing ground in sales to Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics was getting all the publicity from mainstream media. This was Esquire magazine in the fall of '66, the first consumer magazine coverage of Marvel Comics and how they were being read and appreciated by a much older audience. Over at DC, this is, by the way, they got Jack Kirby, of course, to illustrate their double-page spread. Now, the Kirby analog at DC was the great Carmine Infantino. But in 1967, he was the first comic book artist promoted to an executive position when Irwin Donenfeld, the head of DC Comics, made him kind of art director of the entire line at first. But within a year, he became publisher of DC Comics. Carmine Infantino, who, as you saw, drew almost every character for DC Comics, the Jack Kirby equivalent, possibly. But his mandate was to deal with the rising surge of Marvel Comics, to bring in new ideas and new concepts. This is Infantino's own illustrated house ad for DC that ran in their fall 1967 issues. Look at the third word balloon on the left. Could it be new artists, new titles? Well, at the same time Infantino was promoted, he was working on his last feature for DC, this odd character called Deadman that we first saw in this half-page house ad, lettered by the great Irish Snap, of course, with that great Deadman logo. But man, this was a strange-looking dude. We didn't have the word dude back in 1967. But right from the beginning, in Deadman's first issue, we see a character drawn by Infantino, but the attitude was a real kind of bitter, grim attitude, if you read this dialogue, that right away made Deadman an anti-hero, very uncommon at DC Comics. So he was a trapeze artist who performed without a net, hence his name, Deadman, that he would cheat death every night. But on this particular night, while swinging midair, he gets shot and falls to the ground. Instead of being dead, he wakes up off the ground. And in these beautiful Infantino panels, I love the way they're colored too, he goes towards the light and he goes outside the circus tent. And he hears a voice coming from a tree amidst the thunder and lightning. Listen well, for I, Ramakrishna, speak but once. Boston Brand, you shall have the power to walk among men until you have found the one who killed you. It was revealed later in Deadman's run that this was a female Indian spirit, Ramakrishna, but we don't know that at first. But this whole idea of a type of reincarnation appearing in 1967, well, this was right with the spirit of the times. I mean, in the following spring is when the Beatles went to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in India for their famous meditative retreat that resulted in that fall's White Album, of course. The creator of Deadman, the writer of that first story, was the great Arnold Drake, shown here in 2003, about 10 years, I think, before he passed away. He was a longtime pro at DC up until about 1968. But he created the Doom Patrol in 1963, maybe his greatest claim to fame for DC Comics, as they've been characters that have obviously stood the test of time. There's a TV series about them. But the oddball nature of the Doom Patrol prepared us for this character of Deadman, which Drake argued in being a little hipper and a little grittier and a more of an anti-hero would compete with what was happening at Marvel. Well, the only problem with Deadman was that Infantino couldn't draw it anymore after he drew the very first really significant issue. Well, remember when I said that house ad said that maybe it's new artists? Well, lucky for Infantino, at around this time, a 26-year-old artist named Neal Adams walked into the doors of DC Comics. Now, Neal Adams had been drawing a comic strip based on the ABC medical show Ben Casey that ran from 1962 to 1966. And back in 62, Neal Adams was the youngest artist at the age of 21 to ever be awarded a nationally syndicated comic strip because Ben Casey liked Neal Adams' very realistic style, based on photography, as we're going to see. So here's a 1962 biography of Neal, and you can quickly read here in the text. He graduated from the School of Industrial Art, now the School of Art and Design. That school, kind of like DeWitt Clinton in the Bronx, its alumni are legendary in the comic strip and comic book fields too. Maybe I'll do a webinar on that one day. But both old school and new school artists have come out of the School of Art and Design. It's really the Juilliard of comic book and comic strip history. But I hope you're done reading Neal's little bio. Remember, I said he worked from photography, and he often used himself as a model for Ben Casey. You know, he didn't have a lot of photo reference for, what was his name? Vince Edwards, I think, played Ben Casey. And Neal also used his wife, Corey, his late first wife at the time. She passed away about 15 years ago. But you can see her as a model. Now, Neal Adams, coming out of commercial illustration, knew how to use photography. And when he got the Sunday strip, you can see in these two samples, he pushed the boundaries of what he could do in a rectangular space on a daily basis, especially the bottom strip with this kind of strobe effect, instead of breaking it up into separate panels. Remember, most comic strips dailies were usually 4 panels across in that rectangular format. But you can see that the budding great artist that Neal is showing here in these Ben Casey samples was kind of bursting at the limits of what a comic strip can offer him. They gave him a Sunday strip. I forget how many years into the run this was, maybe a year in, but you can see the format of the Sunday strip. But again, it wasn't too long before Neal was bursting at the bonds of what a Sunday strip could give him graphically. So this is the famous Ben Casey head strip, as it's colloquially called. Yeah, 1965, a year before the strip ended. But you can see that Ben Casey's portrait is made up of the separate narrative panel shapes as you read the strip from left to right, top to bottom. And that's an example of how Neal was trying to burst out of the bonds of the static daily and Sunday comic strip. In '66, the TV show came to an end, and so did the comic strip, hence my use of the end panel. But the final end panel was Neal, in a little bit of meta, doing a self-portrait, telling his audience in 1966, seeing the funny papers, except Neal didn't have any intention of staying in comic strips. He tried to go into full-time commercial freelance illustration. You can see from this self-promotion piece that Neal, again, is showing his realism based on photo reference. You can see in this illustration, I'm not sure whether this was originally in full color. I've only ever had a black and white version, but this was commercial magazine illustration of the time. You can see the photo reference Neal must have used for the hospital scene. But legend has it that in 1966, he lost, or his illustration portfolio was stolen from out of one of these ad agencies, I think, that back in the day used to drop off your big leather black portfolio and to a creative director, art buyer, art directors, and they would hold it for a few days along with other people's, and then you'd pick it up 3 days later. Well, I think that's what happened. So Neal said, okay, the illustration world's not for me. Maybe I'll go into comic books. Well, that was a very good day for Carmine Infantino, the day Neal Adams walked into the DC offices, because he found his replacement for Dead Man and a couple of other things. And Neal Adams, I think, was a happy boy as well to be given the reins of a comic book with the things that a daily and Sunday strip didn't offer him. This was really his first, technically his second, what am I saying? His second Dead Man story, but his first Dead Man cover. And the reason why this cover is significant is nobody had ever seen an artist at DC Comics draw that many different faces of that many different genders and ethnicities. And then on top of it, the style of inking, the black within Dead Man's red costume, is really about Neal's facility with pen and ink and brush inking, which he, of course, learned from his years doing a realistic adventure strip, as they were called back then. And you can see in this one example of Ben Casey, which is the final strip I showed before, the many different types of people Neal learned how to draw well, using photo reference, the different ethnicities, genders, and the way you would ink these figures realistically. Well, and all the different emotions and expressions in this one Sunday example of Ben Casey. Well, that's what Neal brought to Dead Man. This bitter character, resentful over the fact that he's a ghost, remember, Neal Adams didn't write these stories. This particular story after Arnold Drake, the editor, Jack Miller, wrote the next couple of Dead Man stories. And you can see that even with the addition of color, it doesn't matter. Neal's drawing and his ability to bring that dialogue, the thought balloons, to life. His facility with human expression. Remember, Dead Man is wearing a white mask. You can't see his pupils. And yet, the emotions he was feeling with this dialogue, this hard-bitten kind of noirish dialogue, made Dead Man come to life. And on top of it, Neal's facility with realism enabled his writer collaborators like Miller and later Robert Kanigher, DC veterans both, to tell stories of a realism never shown before in comics. This is about Mexican immigrants illegally coming over into America on the southern border. This could have been written and illustrated yesterday. And yet this is 1968. And in this particular story, Dead Man takes over the body of the good guy, and he's trying to save one of the Mexican immigrants that's trapped underwater. And you can see in Neal's realism, you know what happened. And when you turn the page, this is an example of the depth of drama that Neal's facility with realism and his spotting of blacks, the simple, almost monochromatic color scheme, to make these stories and these emotions feel real in a way that no comic book character, especially at DC Comics, had ever felt real before. You can feel Dead Man's disappointment without any dialogue or narration at all in Neal's ability to draw human anatomy realism. And then the spotting of blacks on Dead Man's outfit is just beautiful. And then you're hit with the next panel. And that's a perfect example of Neal's combination of realism and stylization, exaggeration with realism, perspective, foreshortening. Very realistic, yet knowing when to stylize and become exaggerated. And that's, I think, Neal's key. So as he's doing Dead Man, what he really wants to do is draw Batman. He's been a Batman fan since he was 10 years old when he drew this Batmobile. So he went to Julius Schwartz, the editor of the Batman titles, in 1968 and said, hey, Julius, let me draw Batman for you. But Julius Schwartz said, sorry, Neal, I've already committed to the artistic genius of Irv Novick to draw Batman full time. And that's a whole story in itself, folks. So what did Neal do? He went to this guy. No, that's not Irv Novick. That's Murray Boltinoff, one of the editors at DC, who DC was a bunch of separate editors with their own little fiefdoms and their own titles and their own writers and their own artists. So that's unlike Marvel, which was, you know, Stan Lee alone, one guy in a little office, and that was it. But DC had separate editors with separate titles. So one of Murray Boltinoff's titles was the Batman team-up title called Brave and Bold, where every issue Batman would team up with another DC character, or in this case, characters. The art for this particular issue, this is only a couple issues before Neal makes his appearance, just to show you folks that the style of Batman before Neal Adams was still redolent of the TV series, even though it had left the air by the spring of '68, which was around the time this issue came out. But you can see that this artist, Bob Brown, and other DC journeymen like Irv Novick, was drawing Batman in the style of what the TV show had been presenting the last couple of years. And the stories were written by a DC veteran, Bob Haney, who is known for more of the lighthearted material at DC in the 60s, like the Teen Titans and the grade B heroes like Aquaman and the offbeat characters like Metamorpho. So Adams knew this. Haney was the regular writer. So he figured, let me draw a cover for editor Boltinoff, because they were going to team up Batman with the Spectre, which was a character Neal was also drawing along with Deadman at the same time. I'll be showing you his Spectre work in my Adams Eclectica, the final webinar on Neal's birthday, what would have been his 81st birthday on June 15th. But look at how this cover appears in the black and white original, and you can see Neal's mastery of the spotting of blacks, casting shadows. The reason why Batman feels real up there is because of Neal's facility with shading and knowing how the shadow of a body would fall on the cape behind him. Even the fantasy figure of Shanzi emerging like a ghost has weight and solidity, that giant arm, because of Neal's beautiful drawing and inking ability. Here's what it looks like in color again. Well, because of this cover, Neal got in good with Murray and said, hey, Murray, I'm drawing Deadman. Why don't we team up Deadman with Batman and let me draw it? And you can have Haney write it. I'll draw it. Well, in the summer of 1968, even though it's dated September, comics are dated 3 months in advance, you have Deadman meeting Batman as drawn by Neal Adams. This is 3 months after the TV show left the air. We had never seen a Batman that kind of looked more real than we'd ever seen him before. The Batman cowl, its original conception back in 1939. This is from the house ad in DC Comics at the time. Look at the way Batman's cowl looks. That's the original Bob Kane conception of the published Batman. But by the mid 40s and into the 50s, it had morphed into this bizarre, grotesque, almost brutalist Batman, and how cartoonish and simplified all the features of the cowl became. And I mean, that Dick Tracy square draw. And even though in the 60s, the more realistic Carmine Infantino came along, and yeah, it was still the same basic stylized cowl. And, it's this version of Batman that made it onto the TV show. They didn't get the eyes right. The straight parts needed to go on top and the crescent needs to go below. That always bugged me. But you can see how by the time Neal Adams draws that first Batman Deadman team up, in the Batman titles, he was still looking like this. This is, again, the artistic genius of Irv Novick. So nobody prepared us for Neal Adams' Batman in that meetup with Deadman when he looked like this. We had never seen a Batman, the man inside the cowl. And yet, if you were reading Deadman, you were used to it. But what we started to see in this first issue was Neal drawing Batman and really making use of his cape as part of his iconography. I mean, nobody was drawing Batman like this in 1968 except Neal in this one issue. But we fans were drooling over a panel like this. Neal went back to Bob Kane's 1939 conception and brought it into the 1968, but drawn realistically. There would be no Dark Knight. There'd be no Batman Begins if it hadn't been for what Neal Adams did in that one issue of Brave and Bold in 1968. Overnight. And for the next 8 issues of Brave and Bold, Adams would continue to blow our collective bat unconscious minds with this new yet retro version of Batman that we hadn't seen, no matter who he was teamed up with. The Creeper, man, that's a whole webinar in itself. But you look at the athletic prowess above, drawn very realistically. The middle panel colored pink for some reason, but it looks beautiful. And then there'd be poses like this down below. That, believe me, folks, back in the day, we Batman fans, we noticed little panels like this. The next team up with the great title, But Bork Can Hurt You, with a great cover and an even greater title page. Beautiful type designed by, that's Neal. And in this issue, I'm giving you the artistic highlights. Panels like this. We haven't seen that in the modern Batman. Again, I love that monochromatic coloring. Whether Neal colored this or not, I'm not sure, but we'll talk about Neal's coloring. But I love the old school Ben-Day dot coloring where panels would get monochromatic. And again, seeing Batman with a giant cape in positions like this, we loved it. Again, look at the monochromatic coloring of the blue figure in the top panel, but the realism, the beauty, the ballet-like movements that Adams was able to capture, not only in that center image, but look at the bottom left panel, a Batman perched on the derrick. Just a little bit there, but it's beautiful. Remember, these are all titles that Haney was already writing. Bob Haney. That's the cover, but look at Neal's black and white ink. And then, how about this, folks? Neal's original concept for the cover, which either he rejected or Murray Boltinoff, the editor, rejected, or maybe even Carmine Infantino, who was overseeing all of DC's covers at the time, and might have laid out some of Neal's covers. Again, there's no paper trail. We don't know for sure. We only have what Carmine has said in interviews and what Neal has said in interviews. But that's neither here nor there, because once again, what this is about are these bat-like positions that Neal was drawing in these brave and bolds that we were ogling and drooling over. The physics of the way he made Batman move, along with the billowing cape, you felt the action in these panels. Neal understood the physics of gymnastics and tumbling. That's why you feel Batman careening off the car top and somersaulting and landing. The story ended with this great pose of Batman with a great end graphic. Now, this was DC's policy at the time that Neal had to work with, that stories would end on a half page or 2/3 page so that DC could sell ad space. To me, this is a desecration of a master's work. I mean, can you imagine a movie ending with a great final image and then the screen enlarging to include an ad along with the ending? But on to better things. Next, Batman would meet the Teen Titans, but that's not Neal Adams. Is that the artistic genius of Irv Novick substituting for Neal? Why? This is May of '69. Was Neal busy that month? Gee, yeah. He was also drawing his first issue of Marvel Comics, the X-Men, issue 56, dated that month. Except this cover, as great as it is, I love the logo with the figures tied to it. But Marvel made Neal change this cover. This was what was actually published that month. Now, folks, a little editorial note. I'll be covering all of that in the June 1st Marvel Works webinar in 2 weeks. So back to the Irv Novick cover, which isn't bad for Irv Novick, but you opened it up and you were treated to another great Neal Adams splash. And this is the first time he's giving us Robin. Now, notice the credits. This is one of the very few times the artist is placed above the story, because again, the stories are great, but Bob Haney, remember, was a regular story writer for DC. Nobody talks about Bob Haney's stories, but they talk about these Brave and Bolds because they are great stories. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. They're meaty. They're all 24 pages long. And Neal, though, was like an auteur, like a movie auteur, taking a screenplay and bringing it to life and making it his storytelling as well. And that's why I think his credit is above Bob Haney's. And this particular story is one of their greatest collaborations. It's about a young ward that, you know, millionaire philanthropist Bruce Wayne adopts. But Lance Bruner is a bad seed, as you can see by these panels and this dialogue. And the Teen Titans don't trust him. But you can see in these bottom panels, he pleads to Bruce Wayne to give him a second chance. He'll prove that he's a good kid. But of course, as the story goes on, the Teen Titans' original judgment of him was proven correct. And as the story goes on, once again, we see these great images of Batman wrapped in his cape, like we had never seen an artist draw him like that before. So in the climax of the story, Batman's confronting the bad guys. I think they're on a kind of an oil derrick. And the bad guy's about to shoot him, but Robin sacrifices himself. That's like thinking an air gun. Yeah, high pressure air hose, a la No Country for Old Men. And then a page later, the bad guy is spooked by what he thinks is Robin, perfectly fine. Dead Stark, then I'm back to haunt you. Well, he gets shot. Robin, why did you sacrifice yourself a second time for me? He thinks it's Robin, but it's not. It's Lance Bruner, the bad seed. Don't worry, Robin's okay. His cape saved him from serious injury. He fell into my boat back there. I switched clothes. Batman, Bruce, hold my hand. Wish I could have been kind of guy you wanted. So long. So long, Lance. And believe me, you were that kind of human being down deep inside. You just never had enough of a chance. You know, folks, it's hard to draw a grown man crying, but drawing Batman behind a mask where you don't even see his pupils is something only Neal Adams could pull off. And as the story ends, he came into our lives like a destructive whirlwind, but he left it in a blaze of hope. We'll never forget him. Thanks for your help, Titans, anytime. And of course, another half-page ad needs to be sold. So Neal Adams and Bob Haney's great ending is muted by Matchbox Models of the Month. Speaking of ads, how about this ad for the next issue of Brave and Bold? How can this be possible? Batman and Sergeant Rock together? Sergeant Rock takes place in World War II. How can this be? Well, before we get to that question, as we look at this poor reproduction of, as we go closer, I'm going to show you this better later, but that wasn't Neal's original cover. This was the black and white inked art. You can see that it's Sergeant Rock gasping for air, but out of the fumes that seem to have killed everybody, or the smoke of battle, is a spirit. It looks like angels, an angel with a trumpet, and then the kind of ghostly image of Batman above. But, you know, they did mock up the cover with all of the lettering and the trade dress, as it's called. And I think the reason why this was rejected, it was just way too busy, probably. and just the off-centeredness of the commandant, and I think the hands are too big. But for whatever reason, because there is no paper trail, Neal ended up drawing really another one of his great covers. There is the nice reproduction that I promised you. And it's almost an icon, this cover. Full screen. But even more stunning was the splash page that you opened up to. Neal using Batman's cape as a viewing portal. Almost imagine the camera going into the black spaces of his cape and coming to that scene. And it was Batman's cape that in this one particular issue that appeared in the early summer of 1969 that, don't even ask me how Batman and Sergeant Rock got together in World War II and then they meet up in present time and Batman's the same age, only in comic books, folks. But it was these images of Batman and his cape that looked like bat wings. Neal Adams even said, when I was drawing Batman, I studied bat wings and bird wings and how they fluttered and moved in the air. And you can see that knowledge. I mean, Neal was really an autodidact and a polymath, but his knowledge of physics and the way fabric and material and motion move and drape and now, I mean, look at that inking on the Batman figures. Again, the spotting of blacks, Neal is just a master of. And some of these images in this Brave and Bold issue are just gorgeous. Each of these three panels is just a study in the way Batman's cape drapes his body, the way it billows, the way it moves. Maybe my single favorite in this issue is this particular panel on the bottom right. I mean, folks, I wish that were the size of a museum wall. If I ever get to design an exhibit of Neal's art, that might be one of the opening entrance walls that you see. The following issue, another landmark, the rebooting of Green Arrow, which, folks, I will go into in its entirety in my upcoming webinar next week on Green Lantern, Green Arrow. But I don't want to get sidetracked, other than to say about this cover, here's another alternate. The story is about how Bruce Wayne and Oliver Queen, Green Arrow secret identity, are both seeing the same psychiatrist. You know, Bob Haney wrote some great stories for Neal to draw, and this was one of them. And I think maybe this was rejected either by Neal or by Murray Boltinoff or Infantino as a little too fey, too well-built men reclining on chaise lounges. I don't know. But yeah, Neal would end up doing this cover instead, which has also become a bit of an icon. And just study this single page of Brave and Bold, folks. The monochromatic coloring, the spotting of blacks, the shading, the panel breakups, the angular panels, yet still clear storytelling. And then you get to the bottom, and we all echo Green Arrow's own thoughts. Now, there's a crime fighter, utterly fearless. He knows exactly where in that darkness his bat rope hangs to stop his dive. Indeed. Folks, these are drawings that future bat artists would make entire careers out of. And every time Neal would draw Batman, it would just be another way of showing the potential, the visual potential of this great character. And, you know, remember in Ben Casey, he felt boxed in, pun intended, by the Sunday strip, by the daily strip. But he said when he got to comics, he had an entire page to work with, page upon page. And as he described it, he just burst out. And you can see it in panel and page designs like this, which again, clear, effective storytelling, yet dynamic so that you feel the action. And here's the final great Batman pose from that particular issue. That brings us to Neal's 8th and last Brave and Bold. appearing in the summer of 1969, the bookend to the first Dead Man Batman appearance. By this time, Dead Man's own strip had been discontinued for about 6 months. So this was Dead Man's reappearance. And in my Dead Man webinar last week, I go in depth into this issue. So if you want to go back to that webinar, you can view that. But let's start with the incredible splash page. Another appearance by Robin. You know, every now and then Neal got to draw Robin, but it's really that Batman figure. And there's the thumbnail sketch done on a piece of 5x7 notebook paper that I ended up designing as the title page of my Neal Adams, the sketchbook, published by Vanguard in 1999. You can still find it at their site, I think Neal Adams site, eBay, whatever. But this is the original hardcover. The region that I wanted to use that title page as the cover, but DC, I think, wanted Vanguard to pay them like $40,000 licensing fee. So I ended up using a generic sketch for the sketchbook cover. But if you've never seen the sketchbook, all the text is Neal talking about the sketches. I, of course, edit all of Neal's words to make them perfect and beautiful. But it's really a primer on the art of sketching itself and how the goal in a sketch, as you bring it to finish, is to capture the beauty of the original sketch, the vibrancy, the effortlessness of it. In this particular case, Neal thinks he failed, and you'll read that in the text. But I'm showing you all this about the sketchbook because here's another page. I don't know of any great painting that didn't start with what they call thumbnail sketches, wash drawings, preliminaries. They're always smaller, and sometimes they're on the side of the canvas. That's really the proper way to do it. Well, this sketch was probably about a quarter of the size of an 8.5 by 11 sheet. Would end up being one of the page layouts in this great Batman Dead Man meetup. And how about those Batman figures on top? Once again, Neal's ability to both be realistic and cartoony, knowing when to use force lines, motion lines, and his knowledge of physics, so that when Batman's body torques the way it's torquing in both of those panels, from the films you've seen of sporting events and gymnastics, you know in your mind what these things look like, but no other artist ever drew them as accurately as Neal did in his Batman comics. Him and Dead Man end up in the Arctic, going after the bad guys, and Neal gets to do some beautiful ghostly panels of Batman here, using Zipatone on the right panel to show the kind of ghostly effect. Look at that beautiful panel there. Well, this was the summer of 1969. This is the cover of my book, The Silver Age of Comic Art, which is about comic art in the 60s and how it reflected what happened in the decade. And of course, Neal Adams is one of the chapters in the book. One of the double-page spreads, I took all those images from that one Sergeant Rock team up, and I laid this text over it. A creature of the night, black, terrible. A weird figure of the dark, this avenger of evil, the Batman. That's, of course, from the 1939 Origin of Batman by Bill Finger. But listen to what Neal says. I didn't do anything to Batman that wasn't already there in a primitive form. What I did was simply redefine him. One of the first things that occurred to me was Batman was supposed to look like a bat. I had bat photographs in my reference file, and I loved the way bats flew. I loved the way birds flew. There was something inspirational about the way they flew that it was clear to me that this was part of what Batman was about. Months later, Julie Schwartz comes down the hall at me with letters saying the only Batman at DC Comics is in Brave and Bold, and asks me, what makes me think I know how Batman ought to look? I said, Julie, it's not just me who knows what Batman ought to be. It's me and every kid in America. The only people who don't know what Batman ought to be are the people here at DC Comics. Well, what an indictment of Julius Schwartz, that he finally relented and gave in and realized he had to have Neal Adams drawing Batman for him. Well, who's going to be your writer? Well, the hot DC writer at the time was Denny O'Neil, a couple of years older than Neal, but like Neal, he was a firebrand and he was hip to the counterculture, and he was kind of the hippest thing DC had in the late 60s in terms of writers compared to, let's say, Roy Thomas over at Marvel. Denny O'Neil was already writing Justice League of America for Julius Schwartz, and Neal Adams had been doing the covers for the previous year. And you can see that Denny O'Neil was writing stories about pollution and relevant subjects. And of course, he would hook up with Neal on Green Lantern, Green Arrow the following year, and I'll talk about that next week. But they would embark together on a string of Batman stories beginning in the fall of '69 with this cover that immediately stood out on the newsstand, especially for Batman, and promised a somewhat exotic adventure for Batman. You can tell right from the splash page, Batman in Mexico? Holy moly, Batman, this wasn't Gotham City anymore. But sure enough, there was the Neal Adams Batman that we loved over in Brave and Bold, and now it was in the Batman titles. I love on this particular page, the final sequence here, where Batman just gracefully jumps off the edge of the cliff. And again, folks, notice Neal's ability to use force lines, motion lines, to make you feel the arc of Batman's descent, along with the realism of Batman's figure, the drape of the cape, the point of view of his camera, and everything else. When you got to the end of the story, you were met with this solemn scene, feeling like the end of a movie. But then, of course, DC had to sell it, or this is a case of a house ad. Thanks a lot, DC. Over on the Batman title, Julius Schwartz would have him draw the covers, while Irv Novick would draw the inside. But what started with the Neal Adams, Denny O'Neil era was leaving behind all the Bat accoutrements that smacked to the TV show, the Batcave, the Batmobile, Alfred, even Robin. In these Neal Adams, Denny O'Neil stories over the next 4 or 5 years, it would be mostly without any of that Bat paraphernalia. And for fans like me that were so sick of all that from the TV show, these Batman stories were a breath of fresh air. So he's doing the covers. And of course, the lead stories, this is coming out in December of 1969, were drawn by the artistic genius of Irv Novick. Sorry, folks, I can't resist using that line. I just love it so much. But, you know, after a great Neal Adams cover, you'd get kind of journeyman Irv Novick art. But in this particular issue, there was a backup story, and that was this. Night falls on Christmas Eve in Gotham. The sidewalks bustle with last-minute shoppers. A peaceful, almost heavenly scene. When injustice and tragedy dare creep in, there's too much contrary experience to believe otherwise for the Batman. Then as the eerie bat signal shimmers against a snow-filled cloud, the atmosphere takes on a celestial composition. For 2,000 years, mystics have experienced the many mysteries surrounding Christmas. Tonight, there will be one more, the silent night of the Batman. Folks, this was a Batman Christmas story. There hadn't been a Batman Christmas story since, I think, the 1940s. It was written by another young buck at DC, Mike Friedrich, who had worked with Neal a year before on the Spectre title. That was really Neal's first great artistic triumph at DC. And once again, I'll be going into that in the Neal Eclectica webinar. But I believe this was Friedrich's first published story, and Neal would spend a career giving young writers and artists breaks by using his clout as the most in-demand artist in the industry to bring young people into the field. And The Silent Night of the Batman is the fruit of his labor. And it's all about how Commissioner Gordon asked Batman to take the night off. It's Christmas Eve. Come on, have a hot toddy with me and the gang, and we're gonna sing Christmas carols. And Batman goes along with it. And as he starts singing, the camera shifts to these silent vignettes that Friedrich writes and Neal draws beautifully, that are all about how somehow, while Batman is not physically there, his spirit forces people like these kids to do the right thing. And what do? They wrap up the action figure and give it back to the woman they stole it from. In the second vignette, we see a guy with a gun bumping into Batman. You turn the page. It's a Bat Santa. And he has a crisis of conscience and throws away the gun. And the third vignette, of course, I think they saved the best for last. He's making a list, checking twice. Obviously, this woman is getting the note that her husband was killed in Vietnam. Remember, folks, this is 1969, the height of the Vietnam War. And this beautifully drawn page, again, folks, simple panel design. Neal saved his experimenting panel designs really over at Marvel Comics, which we'll see in 2 weeks. But notice it's the shadow of the bridge in the form of a bat, just as her husband, alive, jumps off the Army transport. No dialogue and narration needed when you've got an artist like Neal Adams that's able to facilitate all of these motions and movements. Next, you get some beautiful calligraphy on top. Good heavens, it's 6 o'clock. We've been singing here all night. We haven't been disturbed by one report of robbery, murder, drug peddling, anything. It's like the spirit of Christmas peace took hold on everyone. But what is the Christmas spirit? Oops, let me go back there. I pressed the button by mistake. But what is the Christmas spirit, Batman? Might it not be you or I? What? My eyes playing tricks, eh? Amazing, says Commissioner Gordon. We've been waiting here all night and not a single call has come in for you. It appears the investment you put into the city is paid off tonight, giving you a night off. Investment, spirit of Batman, Christmas spirit. As the spirit of the peaceful night becomes one with the city, dawn creeps and covers the skyline, and a new day begins. For 2,000 years, mystics have experienced the many mysteries surrounding Christmas. Today, there is one more, the silent night of the Batman. I always thought this dynamic last panel had to be an influence on the great Bill Sienkiewicz. When over at Marvel Comics in the early mid-'80s, he was drawing Moon Knight, who you might know from the latest Marvel streaming TV series. But Sienkiewicz started out as the ultimate Neal Adams clone, line for line. Nobody got Neal Adams better than Bill Sienkiewicz in the 1980s. But as you can see in this double-page spread, by the mid-'80s, he begins to break out of the Neal Adams mold and becomes the future multimedia genius artist that he is today and has been for decades now. But in the early 80s, when he was making a splash with basically Moon Knight was Marvel's Batman knockoff, the leading critical journal, the Comics Journal, had this cover by early Bill Sienkiewicz. I think this is circa 1983, maybe, something like that. Maybe earlier, maybe it's 81, I'm not sure. But out of my way, old timer, Whoa, throwing down the gauntlet. So what does Neal Adams do? A couple issues later, they print this on the back cover. Well, excuse me. Oops. Hey, who is this guy? I don't know, but you notice he's copying Bill Sienkiewicz's style. What a ripoff. So back to Batman. In Detective Comics, this would be Neal's third solo Batman story and his second with Denny O'Neil, called Paint a Picture of Peril. Now, folks, people talk about comics as being film on paper, and I want to show you what that really means as you read the opening page of this story. And you can feel it like it's a movie. A gentle twilight at Gotham Bay, a stillness broken only by distant echoes from the nearby streets and the gentle lapping of the sea. It is the eve before the opening of the annual Marine Festival, an event that pours millions into worthy charities, an event that now brings from the depths evil. It feels like you're watching a movie. Neal's facility with realism. But then you turn the page, and this is what you see. The Batman. So what? We're 4-1. Nail him. He's moving too quick. Up. Take him alive would be the biggest man in the East Coast art. Hold it long. I don't have to read all the dialogue. You get it. And I mean, as you take in all of the action on this page and the way Neal, like a great movie director, takes you through this whole sequence where you see, you feel it. But most of all, again, these figures of Batman swathed in his flowing cape were something that Neal was experimenting with at the time. The very next issue of Detective Comics. And remember, folks, he didn't draw all the interiors, you know, Irv Novick, Bob Brown. I'm showing you, and I can't show you every cover either because Neal did so many covers in consecutive order. I'm really showing you what I believe are his greatest hits. But notice how with this cover appearing dated April 1970, that what Neal is really doing is a modern realistic version of the classic Spotlight cover back in 1940 or 41, illustrated by my favorite Golden Age Batman Bob Kane ghost artist named Jack Burnley, who also did the great Sunday syndicated Batman strip, by the way. But you can see how even this, the next cover of Detective Comics, also has that kind of cape that Adams was becoming a master of. Man, as you note the dynamics of this cover, check it out in black and white. And just another primer on realistic pen and ink and brush inking, spotting of blacks, shading, shadows, and just the whole dynamic perspective of this and how your eye follows up the action to the samurai villain at the top, and how much color brings to the composition. And I've got to believe, you know, Neal loved coloring his own work, especially when he penciled it and inked it, like all these covers. And they're just so beautifully drawn, inked, and colored. They really are mini masterpieces. Now, some of them aren't masterpieces like this one. Why am I showing you this cover, which was a whole takeoff on the Paul is Dead controversy that sprouted up in the fall of '69? That's when this was probably written and drawn, and then it doesn't appear until the spring of 1970. But there's Neal's black and white ink and one of his rare thumbnail sketches for the cover. So once again, folks, this is probably a quarter of a page of an 8.5 by 11 piece of basic Xerox paper. And look how close it gets to the finish. So Neal always captures it in the thumbnail and just brings it to life. So around this time, Neal liked working up at the DC offices, and he walks past Julia Schwartz's office, And the writer, Frank Robbins, who wrote the other Batman stories that Denny O'Neil didn't write, is trying to come up with something with Julius Schwartz, and they're getting nowhere. And Julius Schwartz says, Neal, you got any ideas? And Neal said, yeah, I've had this idea for a while. I call it Man Bat. And Neal goes on to explain what it's about, but he's very practical. He says, Julie, if you don't do Man Bat, Marvel can do Man Bat and own it, because it's not Batman, it's Man Bat. And the fact that this sketch exists, because basically Julius Schwartz said, okay, Neal, I'll agree to do Man Bat, but Frank's going to write it, but you've got to commit to drawing it, okay? Well, you know that was Neal's plan all the while. He wanted to get his idea of a Man Bat into print. So he would let Frank Robbins, of course he wrote the story, but man, it starts with that sketch and this incredible cover, another one of Neal's mini masterpieces. And again, the lighting, the coloring. Folks, this is not computer coloring. This is 1970. This is old school Ben-Day dot coloring, but what Neal was able to achieve are just some of the greatest old school Ben-Day dot coloring covers ever done. Here's the opening splash page. You can see Frank Robbins' story credit above. So our protagonist is a scientist working at a museum named Langstrom, Kirk Langstrom. And he's a big Batman fan, very meta. And he's trying to come up with an injection that will give a person the natural ability of a bat that even the great Batman doesn't possess. Oh, I thought he was doing this to help. I guess he was doing it for himself to try, whatever the story goes. It's not important. He injects it into himself. And of course, he begins to morph or metamorphose into what you know is coming. And some great Neal drawing. In silent gnawing anguish, the delver into the unknown rushes wildly across the room. And then in one reeling moment of heart-struck realization, the immensity of his achievement is revealed to him. I'm becoming a Man Bat. And yeah, only Neal could pull off the realism and the exaggeration to really make you feel his shock and horror at what he's become. And how about this page design using the bat to break up the panels? Turn the page and you see this. He's running away. He's hungry, ravenously hungry. The museum cafeteria, through the gem collection. And then you get Neal giving us his idea of a Batmobile. Remember, I told you most of these stories over these next 4 or 5 years don't have any of the Bat paraphernalia like the Bat Cave or the Batmobile. But every now and then, Neal would trot out his idea. And I've always kind of dug this. You know, my Batman doesn't tuck his cape under his ass and get into a car. I only like Batman swinging on a rope. But if you're going to have a car, I kind of dig this one. Not to mention Neal's facility with drawing Batman, the torque, the motion. We can study just this one panel, folks, all day long. Not to mention the bad guys in solid black are also primers on drawing human anatomy in silhouette. You get to the end of the story and Batman confronts Man Bat. Man, you're even more of a bat than I ever was. And with your added ability to see in the dark, you've topped me. What an awe-inspiring disguise. Screet. Disguise. Disguise. I only wish it were. I've succeeded only too well. Obviously, he doesn't want me to follow him, and I owe him at least that. But he would make a formidable friend. Or foe? Which will it be? And which role would the Man Bat re-enter the Batman's life? Be on the lookout for the Man Bat in a forthcoming issue of Detective Comics. The Man Bat would go on to be a leading DC Comics character in his own right. In 1992's debut of the great Batman animated series, the very first episode on Leather Wings featured the animated series version of Man-Bat. Bruce Timm got the great artist Kevin Nolan to design Man-Bat based on, of course, Neal Adams' original. Because you can see, especially in these storyboard sketches, the way that Man-Bat moved comes right out of Neal's understanding of the way a bat's wings would really be illustrated to get across the feeling of motion and movement, which is what, of course, Neal displayed in what has to be one of my single favorite covers. Again, folks, the subtlety of the coloring, the way Adams was able to achieve the tones was not something you saw in every Batman cover. And I wish there was a paper trail of how Neal did these covers with the DC production department, the head of coloring, Jack Adler, but both are gone. And it's an area of comics history that just hasn't been documented. And we can only surmise how masterpieces like this were created. So in this, the second Man-Bat story, also written by Frank Robbins, there's where that sample I just showed you comes from. We get a nice close-up of a grim Batman face. Again, beautifully shaded. Neal gets the chance to draw the Batmobile again. At the end of the story, he traps Man-Bat in the Batcave. Remember I told you very rarely did we see the Batcave? Well, this was one of them. Still breathing, but for how long? If he should live and his brain is permanently damaged, would I be more than a curse or blessing or restored to him for him? To live out his days as a vegetable? Merciful heaven. What an impossible decision to make. There can be only one answer. If he must die, let it be as the man he once was. Which will it be, man or bat? Only a future issue of Detective Comics can tell. Well, it wasn't the next issue of Detective Comics, because that featured just another stunning cover. Not the interior. The interior was another Bob Brown story. But man, we bought these issues just for these incredible covers. And Neal would use these illustratory effects like the grease pencil background. He would use it again a year later on this Detective Comics cover. It wasn't quite a bait and switch. We knew Neal Adams was only human. He couldn't draw every issue of Batman and Detective. You hoped after seeing a cover like this, you would get a Batman story, but no. But again, we bought these just for the covers. Oops, I jumped the gun there. There's another beautiful mezzotint cover by Neal. And then we got this issue of Detective Comics with this awesome cover. Issue 404, appearing in the summer of 1970. Again, how could Batman exist in World War I where Enemy Ace existed? Well, I rarely jump to the final page of a story to introduce it, but this was some kind of odd team up between Batman and a character who lived during World War I. I'm not sure how they pulled this one off. But you can see that Denny O'Neil, the writer, and Neal and Julia Schwartz intended the story to be a tribute to Kubert and his soulmate writer, editor, partner, Robert Kanigher. Well, a year before, Joe Kubert was drawing Enemy Ace, except for one issue. He planned on a fill-in issue. You can see in the caption on the bottom right, by the great Alex Toth. Well, the problem is Alex Toth deviated too much from Robert Kanigher's script. And when he showed it to Kubert, as great as it was, Kubert rejected it because it wasn't Kanigher's script. I think Toth was so upset that he ripped up the pages. They've never been printed. But in a bind, Kubert went to Neal Adams, and Neal Adams would end up drawing the story. He penciled it and Kubert inked it, probably over a weekend. But if you just look at the double page spread that Neal penciled, Neal said that every one of his panels looked like it might have been penciled by Kubert, and yet he made sure that not a single view that he drew was ever duplicated by Kubert himself. So that's the beauty of this particular story, which I'll show a little more of in my Adams Eclectica. But this is why they had this special relationship. So a year later, they do this story. And by the way, one last thing about this incredible cover is that I used that Batman figure in this article that I wrote for a graphic design trade magazine called Print, showing how Bruce Timm understood in animating Batman that you can't do it super realistically. Animation is limited. You've got to stylize it. Ironically, his black and white stylization owes a lot to Alex Toth. But there's the full page from the article. And the next time I do a Batman webinar, I'll show this more in depth. But back to that Enemy Ace sort of team up story. When we were shown pages like this, our eyes went right to the Batman character, because remember, folks, all of these positions we had never seen drawn so beautifully, so realistically. The physics of fighting that Neal understood in his drawing, you felt the kicks, you felt the punches, and then he'd hit you with a stylized, dramatic panel. It doesn't matter how Batman could be in World War I times. How great was that figure? How great was that cape? Even on a somewhat pedestrian page like this, you'd get a figure that would jump out at you. Well, it jumped out to the powers that be at DC, because they obviously got Adams to redraw it, and it was used as one of these commercial stickers that DC would market in full page ads that looked like this, circa 1971. So this came out about a year later. All through the 70s, though, that figure would be used in advertising and in branding. A year later, March of 71, DC would actually use it in reverse as their kind of Batman logo, and they'd run it for a year. But I'm jumping ahead, keeping in our timeline. This was the icon they were using, November of 1970. And this is another example of the bait and switch. You'd get a very cool Neal Adams cover, Batman with a great cape there, right? And then you'd open it up and you'd get the artistic genius of Irv Novick. Sorry, Irv, I can't help it. But yeah, there it is. The real artistic genius, of course, was Neal Adams. The same month over at Detective Comics, he gave us this cover. Not only a beautiful perspective, not only an incredible tree, not only great lighting. Neal loved the color green, I'm convinced. Greens and browns are a big hallmark of the coloring on these mini masterpieces. Nothing more so than on the masterpiece he would give us a month later, December of 1970, which means it was late fall, maybe September. I remember I'm 12 years old at this time and visiting my grandmother in the Bronx, in a pretty kind of distressed urban area. But they had a candy store that had comics. Back in those days, that's where you bought your comics, at what were called candy stores. They had magazines, sometimes a soda fountain, but this particular little store in the Bronx, it was a very thin, long store, and at the back wall was their rack where they had their comics. And we went to visit our grandmother and went down to the candy store, and I remember stepping into the store, and this cover was 20 feet away from me in the rack. And I remember gasping out loud when I saw it at how great it was. Now remember, folks, DC didn't reprint They're golden age comics. I probably had not seen this cover, even though it's very common now. It's been reprinted everywhere. But back in 1970, there weren't a lot of old reprints. So we didn't know that Neal Adams, the great comic historian that he was by nature, basically went back to this cover and just drew it realistically in his style. Now, while I consider this his single greatest Batman cover, as a graphic designer, the logo, the trade dress elements, the intrusiveness, I mean, the fact that the Robin icon is sitting right on the edge of the moon, the fact that the lettering, the G in Gothos is, again, hitting Batman the edge of his shoulder. These are called tangents that are uncomfortable. You may not be able to articulate it if you're not an artist or graphic designer, but I feel compelled to show you what I would do if Neal Adams handed me this cover. I would have art directed it to look more like this. I love the 1960s Batman logo, and that's the one I would have used. I would have picked up the purple from the girl's dress down below. Well, I hope you like this one, but it was never to be, only in my dreams and in this webinar. The reason why Neal drew this cover was in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a big sales craze in paperback books specifically of novels, romance novels, with a woman in a Gothic mansion in the background. I'm only showing you 2 examples of the dozens I have in my files. That's how popular this motif was. So Neal would draw it, like you see here, on one of his many House of Secrets covers, which I'm going to show in the Neal Adams Eclectica webinar coming up. This is a beautiful cover Neal did, done in wash, not in pen and ink, as you can see. He also did the Gothic lady in a mansion in space somehow. But most of his covers for House of Secrets and House of Mystery at the time, he was doing covers since 1969. So he's already into them about a year. They all had to do with monsters or demons threatening kids. Neal had kids at the time that were roughly of the age he's drawing them. So it wasn't a surprise when at the same time he's doing covers like this. Remember Brave and Bold? He hadn't been there since issue 86. But in a cover dated January 71, which came out, again, late fall 1970, we get this bizarre team up of the Batman and the House of Mystery. How is this possible? Well, let's see. Right away, folks, we noticed that Neal Adams inked this one himself. And we noticed from the startling color choices that he colored it. When I worked for Neal, I asked him, why did you choose to ink certain jobs and others you gave to Dick Giordano or other inkers? I know you couldn't ink everything, but why did you choose which issues you inked? And he said, Arlen, whenever I felt a story was special, I made the time to ink it. Well, this story, folks, is one of them, because other than the earlier Brave and Bolds, many of which he inked himself, he only inks 3 Batman stories in his entire 5-year run after those early Brave and Bolds. And this was the first of 3. We're going to talk about the other 2 in tomorrow night's webinar, part 2. But suffice it to say, in this one, we get some just beautiful panels. Now, no offense to Giordano, but he didn't put in the fine line cross-hatching that you see in these incredible panels. And just the humanity of Batman, the way his arm is posed in the shadows here. How about you can feel the torque of Batman's body, the fact that he feels weary, that he stumbled like some rank amateur. This is Neal, the illustrator auteur, bringing Denny O'Neil's writing to life, which is the job of an illustrator. Great Commissioner Gordon close up in the bottom right. And there's the story, Red Water, Crimson Death. So, you know, Bob Haney used to write all the Brave and Bolds, but in this one special issue, Denny O'Neil came over to Murray Boltinoff and wrote this one, and Neal thought it was such a good story that he decided to ink it. And by inking it, we would be treated to literally some of the greatest single Batman drawings ever done by Neal, which means in the history of Batman. How about this sequence? Courage, lads. Adam, hold it. I'm a friend. Says a thing from beyond the grave. You're a Batman. You're right and wrong. I love that. And again, folks, when you look at these beautiful color choices, you know that Neal colored this as well as penciled and inked it. This sequence, he's running into an old Irish castle where the bad guys are. Got to catch him. There could be a mob inside. I'm not up to a major fight. The gate falling. I've got maybe 1 single second to decide. Either stop and not risk getting skewered on the gate spikes, or make a dive for it. Once again, folks, the mastery of Neal's realism, along with his ability to cartoon, put motion lines, to know how the cape would get caught on the bottom of the iron gate. Art teachers, can spend an entire class discussing the diagonal that Adams uses of the cape and the shadow on the wall behind, compositionally. The fact that you feel and hear the sound effect chung because of all the movies and TV shows you've seen in which iron gates chung and clang. So everything about this one panel is just a master class in drawing. And then again, my single favorite. First, notice again the simplicity of the panel design. Neal said his Batman stories are very easy to follow. People think that he had crazy panel designs on every page. No. In his Batman stories, it was what was in the panel that counted. And nobody to this day, folks, has understood Batman realistically and stylistically as Neal Adams. And he was able to go from a scream like this to a whisper like this, my other favorite Neal Adams comic book panel. To this day, Neal Adams does not get the credit for some of the quiet panels he drew like this. Folks, you feel this image on every level. You feel the cool air. You know what that sky looks like and feels like. I love this panel so much that I used it for the logo of the Facebook group that I run. So come friend me and join my group, Best Neal Adams Discussion on the Internet. This issue also featured, after the story ended, a significant full-page house ad by DC Comics saying how earlier that summer they had won the top honors. Those are all portraits by Neal. Infantino, Kubert, Dick Giordano, and then we get down to the bottom. Double honors for Neal Adams. Honored by the convention for the new perspectives and the dynamic vibrancy he has brought to the field of comic art. Neal Adams also won an Alley Award as Best Pencil Artist. No wonder, at the age of 21, Neal was the youngest artist ever to have his own strip, and he's now serving as vice president, blah, 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 blah. He's won acclaim from DC fans for his work on Batman. Yeah, you think? And it was this work on Batman, these first, let's see, summer of 68, 69, into the end of 1970, that contributed to Neal Adams being considered the greatest Batman artist of all time. Now, folks, you don't think I'm going to end it there at the end of 1970. What about the rest of Neal Adams' Batman career? Well, that'll be in Neal Adams Part 2, Neal Adams Batman Part 2. And when will I be doing this? Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel. And folks, if you go to my website at the events blog subpage, I always post all of my comings and goings with the URL links that you will need to get to it. Other pages on my website for comic book history, you can learn about my Silver Age book and how to order a signed and sketched in copy directly from me. I also run a Facebook group on the Silver Age and one on Jack Kirby. You can see Kirby's influence in my work on this Fantastic Four knockoff. I do what I call turning people into their inner superheroes. I maintain the photographic likeness, but keep the comic book look, as you can see in these many samples. My website's also linked to the commercial site TeePublic, where you can get over 125 of my illustrations and every kind of application, knick-knack, gewgaw, thingamabob you can think of. So support your local artists. My visual lectures and webinars page is linked to both my YouTube channel and my Vimeo channel, where you can see videos of my recent webinars, and as you scroll back in time to my pre-pandemic live lectures. My Vimeo channel has all of the webinars that carry copyrighted content that YouTube's lawyers flag, but Vimeo's don't. So that's why I have many of my videos. You can see Bruce Springsteen, Twilight Zone, Bond, and others. So folks, continuing with my memorial webinar series, next Wednesday, tomorrow night will be Batman Part 2, and next Wednesday, the 25th, I'll be doing Green Lantern Green Hour. Originally, I was going to do the Marvel work chronologically, as I showed you tonight. Neal's X-Men comes 6 months before his Green Lantern Green, actually about a year before. But I need more time to put together the Marvel work, so I'll run Green Lantern Green Arrow next week and Marvel to come. So folks, I hope to see you tomorrow night at Neal Adams Part 2. And my name is Arlen Schumer, and I look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.